Good morning, everyone. In Introduction to Ethics, I'm going to give you a brief lecture video on Book 2 of Aristotle's Ethics today. I hope that the video yesterday was helpful for you. Um, it may have been a bit rushed. I'm not following an outline, so it may have been a little bit all over the place, but I do hope that it's helpful for you. I want to highly encourage you to be sure you're clicking on the links on the syllabus as well as watching these videos. Um, there are a lot of questions in your discussion post last night about what happiness is for Aristotle and why he's talking so much about happiness. And the goal of Book 1 of Aristotle's Ethics is that he thinks that, well, first of all, for Aristotle, ethics has to be about happiness. Whenever we are doing the right thing, or whenever we are making good choices, he thinks it should make us happy. It's a fundamental tenet of ethics for Aristotle that doing good things should make us, or doing the right thing, being ethical, should make us happy. The question, so there's a sort of there's an assumed connection between the two. So that's why Book One is so much about happiness, because doing good things, making good choices should make us happy. But Aristotle wants to show that there is a thing called the highest good, what's called the summum bonum in Latin, the highest good. And he wants to say that we all implicitly agree that this thing exists called the highest good. When we talk about happiness, we we wouldn't even be able to have a conversation with each other unless we were presupposing that there is a thing called happiness. There is a thing called that. There is a state that we are all in called happiness. If everybody meant something different by happiness, then it wouldn't be a meaningful, intelligible conversation. So Aristotle wants to say we all implicitly agree that this thing exists, and he just wants to tell us more about what it is, and that it is the highest good, happiness. It's not a particular good. There's a distinction between goods, plural, and the good. And Aristotle needs to show in Book 1, needs to establish that this thing exists called the good. And if he can convince you that there is this thing called the good that exists, then he can continue making his argument about specifically what that is. And he basically, so the distinction between a concept and a conception that I referred to in Monday's reading was important, or yesterday's reading was important. It's the idea that the highest good, happiness, would be once we are engaged in it or have it, we don't need anything else. It is self-sufficient. And so that is the crucial moment, that the concept, which is to say, a concept is something that we all recognize. We use concepts to organize the world. A tree, for example, is a concept that allows all of us, when we're engaged in a conversation, to know what each other is talking about. Concepts are organizing principles, organizing mental principles that all of us can use to engage in the same conversation about the same world together. And so when he says concept, he's saying this is not just Aristotle's own personal opinion, but that there is a thing called happiness, that when we have it, we don't need anything else. It doesn't mean that there aren't goods that we will need to help us get there, but once we get there, we won't need anything else. That it is self-sufficient and good in itself, not good as a means to some further end. So there is this thing called the highest good. Aristotle calls it happiness. And that is what he has to show in Book 1 exists. And he thinks we all agree that it exists. He just wants to be more precise about what it is. And so one of the other things that emerges in Book 1 is what's called Aristotle's function argument. Aristotle says if there is this thing called the highest good that we're going to call human happiness, how can we get a little bit more traction about what it actually means and what it consists in? What does it mean to achieve this highest human good? And again, for Aristotle's universe, it means asking about the kinds of creatures that we are, which is to say, what is a human being's function? What is our characteristic activity, as he calls it? Everything in Aristotle's universe has a characteristic activity. It is a teleological universe. I talked about the knife in yesterday's reading, that when it is performing its characteristic activity well, it means it is excelling at being the thing that it is. And so a human being's characteristic activity is reasoning, but reasoning well, right? Not just reasoning, because you can reason poorly. So it's not just enough to reason, it's to reason well, which is to say to reason virtuously. And so that is what's established in Book One, that happiness will consist in reasoning well, reasoning virtuously. And so there's a tight connection between happiness and virtue. Happiness for Aristotle is an activity, not just a state that we achieve. It's not just simply a psychological condition. So when I say I am happy at any given moment, that's not what Aristotle means. Happiness is an activity that we engage in continuously over the course of a lifetime. So there's a tendency in popular culture and to equate happiness as simply a psychological condition that we feel at a certain moment. But if that's all happiness was, then Aristotle wouldn't really have to say much about it. If it was, it has to be the highest good, something that we continuously strive to engage in. Right? So you have to really dissociate your intuitions about what you hear when you hear the word happiness from what Aristotle means by it. Often that's what doing philosophy requires, is to suspend your intuitions that come to mind when you hear words. Philosophy wants to interrogate those intuitions and ask whether there's any good reason behind the intuitions. And that's what Aristotle is doing. So, by the end of Book One, we get this idea that happiness consists in exercising our reason well. And by Book Two, Aristotle's going to show us what it means to reason well. What is that consist in? What is reasoning virtuously consist in? And for Aristotle, it's going to consist in reasoning well, this is another sense in which Aristotle it's somewhat common sense. Aristotle looks at something like when so on page 25, Aristotle's sort of commonsensically going to say that when we say we are doing something well, what does that mean? When we say, for example, that we are exercising well, that we are healthy, for example, that we are strong, he says that often we intuitively recognize that we can either achieve too much of something or too little of something. So to be called healthy is a kind of mean state between too much and too little. So when he says on page 25, he says, first, let us consider this. The fact that states like this are naturally corrupted by deficiency and excess. So deficiency and excess, Aristotle is going to call vices, as we see in the cases of strength and health. Both too much exercise and too little ruin one's strength, and likewise too much food and drink and too little ruin one's health, while the right amount produces, increases, and preserves it. The same goes then for temperance, courage, and other. So there are going to be particular virtuous states that we can achieve, and that's what he's saying, that courage itself is a virtuous state that we can be in. Temperance, we can be temperate. Temperate is a virtuous state that we can be in, right? So there's too much and too little. So it's this intuitive proposition that Aristotle's saying here is that when we are a certain way, when we say that we are healthy, it means that we have achieved some kind of equilibrium between being excessively healthy and being deficiently healthy. In other words, we'd be sick, or being overly healthy would be like, I mean, the thing that comes to mind for me is like when you get these men's health magazines, or women's health for that example, or for that matter, and you see these individuals who are like posing with their muscles and their veins are popping out and they look disgusting. Quite frankly, that is being overly healthy, I think. So healthy is a mean state. It's going to be important to understand what he means by mean state. It doesn't mean a middle state. It doesn't just mean it's a mean in Aristotle is not an arithmetic mean. It's not an arithmetic mean. It's not a mathematical mean. I'm going to say more about that in a second. But Aristotle, because Aristotle has said, so in Book 1, Aristotle thinks Aristotle has shown that happiness consists in reasoning well, and reasoning well will be reasoning according to some kind of mean state. And to be in that mean state is to be virtuous. But Aristotle wants to say, but what, by book 5, right? By chapter 5 in book 2, he says, okay, next we must consider what virtue is. So I'm here in the text on page 28. We must consider what virtue is. There are 3 things to be found in the soul. The soul is like a human personality. It's our psyche. The Greeks talked a lot about a soul, which is kind of a metaphysical concept, but it has a lot of analogs for example, in psychology. We talk about the psyche in psychoanalysis. But he says in the soul we find 3 different things, and he wants to say which of these is virtue. Is it a feeling? Is it a capacity? Or is it a state? And this chapter is really crucial because Aristotle's going to establish what virtue specifically is here, before going on to elaborate further. Now, we've already kind of said virtue he's going to determine it's a state. And this chapter is crucial because ethics has to be, in some sense, about praise and blame. If we're going to talk about ethics has to presuppose some kind of accountability, that I voluntarily acted a certain way. Ethics is if we're praising and blaming each other, we can only praise and blame each other on the basis of freely made choices. If they're not freely made, then I can't praise or blame you for the choice you made. Maybe you were forced to do it, or it was something beyond your control. And so we have to figure out virtue. To be virtuous means that we are choosing freely to be virtuous. We can't have been forced to be virtuous or accidentally found ourselves being virtuous. We have to freely choose to be virtuous. So that's going to be crucial here in chapter 5. So he wants to say first, is virtue a feeling? Well, no, because Aristotle says we don't praise or blame anyone on the basis of the way that they feel. Why? Because you don't choose to feel a certain way. You just find yourself feeling a certain way. You think about the last time you were angry. Did you choose to be angry, or did something cause you to be angry and you found yourself feeling angry? Similarly with a capacity. Capacity is it's our ability to do something, but we don't praise or blame someone on their capacities, right? So that's how he says, by capacities, I mean the things on the basis of which we are described as being capable of experiencing certain feelings, right? And he says, we don't praise or blame capacities, and we don't praise or blame feelings, but we do praise or blame the way that we respond when we feel a certain way. So he goes on the page top of 29, he says, So reading from the bottom of 28, he says, neither the virtues nor the vices are feelings, because we are called good or bad on the basis not of our feelings, but of our virtues and vices, and also because we are neither praised or blamed on the basis of our feelings. Um, the person who is afraid or angry is not praised, and the person who is angry without qualification is not blamed, but rather the person who is angry in a certain way. We are praised and blamed on the basis of, again, we become angry or afraid without rational choice, right? So we don't choose to become angry. While the virtues are rational choices, or in any way involve rational choice. Again, in respect of our feelings, we are said to be moved, while in respect of our virtues and vices, we are said not to be moved, but to be in a certain state, right? So it's going to be when you find yourself becoming angry, how do you respond? That is in your control, but the fact that you're angry is not, right? And so that's what we're praising and blaming here. If ethics is about praise and blame, we're praising and blaming virtues and vices, about how you choose to respond when you feel a certain way, or how you act when you feel a certain way. That is in your control. But the fact that you feel a certain way is not, right? So now in chapter 6, Aristotle is going to go on. He says, okay, we've discovered that virtue is a state that we are in. What kind of state, right? Well, this is where he's going to talk about the same thing that you can be too much or too little of something. So on page 20, on the bottom of 29, he says, in everything continuous and divisible, one can take more, less, or an equal amount, and each either in respect of the thing itself or relative to us. And the equal is a sort of mean between excess and deficiency. So excess and deficiency are what Aristotle is going to call vices. We can be too much or too little of something, right? But the mean is going to be relative to us. That's the crucial difference, is that it is a relative mean. It is not it's not going to be arithmetically in the middle of the excess and the deficiency, right? So then let's go to the next page. On page so to be virtuous then is going to consist in how we reason when we find ourselves feeling a certain way, how we act when we find ourselves feeling a certain way, how we respond to a particular kind of emotion, right? So at the top of 35, Aristotle gives a definition of virtue, a specific definition. Virtue then is a state involving rational choice, consisting in a mean relative to us and determined by reason. The reason, that is, by reference to which the practically wise person would determine it. So Aristotle's, what he's saying at the end there is that we actually need exemplars, models of what engaging in virtuous activity looks like, to help us figure out what it's like. Because being virtuous is not easy; it's very difficult, right? So, so, um, so now, Aristotle goes on to say, not every action or feeling admits of a mean. Some have names immediately connected with depravity, such as spite, shamelessness, envy, adultery, theft. So here Aristotle is specifically saying that that you can't be a good thief. That immediately to be a thief is immediately to be vicious, which is just the adjective of vice, right? So if you're wondering, is Aristotle setting up this case where you can be a good murderer? Well, no. Already that there are just certain kinds of activities that don't admit of being virtuous, because being virtuous means performing your activity well. And if you're reasoning about being a good thief, it already indicates you're not reasoning well. Okay, so then we're getting at about 20 minutes here. I usually don't want to keep these videos much longer than that. I just want to say so now we've discovered that to be virtuous, to praise or blame individuals, is to understand how it is that they reason when they are feeling a certain way, right? So Aristotle so what you're reading for tomorrow, which will be on the exam, by is about particular virtues. He's going to go through a big catalog of these. And there are some in today's lecture notes as well. So if you take a look at the lecture notes that I have uploaded, right, Aristotle gives an example, or I give some examples on page 2 of the notes, right? So in chapter 6, in my notes here, I give you some examples. So let's say that we are afraid, right? That we are feeling fear. The virtue that corresponds to the feeling of fear would be courage, right? But we could feel fear, we could either feel too much fear or we could feel not enough fear. Feeling too much fear would be cowardly. Feeling not enough fear, or excuse me, feeling not enough fear would be foolhardy, whereas feeling too much fear would be cowardly. So you can have a deficiency of fear or an excess of fear, right? And um, and so the question is, how do you, so you're going to have to give yourself some examples, putting yourself in some situations here. But what you're going to get in book 4 from Aristotle is a bunch of examples of how all these virtues play out, what the excess is, what the deficiency is, and how all of them work, right? That's what book 4 is about, giving you examples of virtues and how it is that the virtuous state is going to be a mean, but it's going to be relative, because it's not always going to be the case that it's going to be right in the middle between the excess and the deficiency. It's not always going to be right in the middle. It may be closer to the excess. The situation and the circumstances may demand that it be closer to the excess and the deficiency, but it will still be a mean nonetheless, but a relative mean. Right? But it's still going to give us a standard and a way to evaluate and judge human activities. So I hope that this gives you some clarification about what's going on in Book 2. Book 2 is telling us that virtue is a state between excess and deficiency by which a person chooses how to respond. Book 4 is just going to give you a bunch of examples of specific virtues. I hope this is helpful. Please email me if you have any questions, and I will talk to you soon.